Hey students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is disenfranchisement, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. In the last lesson, you saw how after Reconstruction ended in 1877, the federal government removed its troops from the South, and whites went about taking away the rights that freedmen had gained during Reconstruction. You learned how sharecropping violated the 13th Amendment by creating a system of forced labor that was in many ways similar to slavery. And you learned how segregation and Jim Crow violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Today, you are going to learn how Southern whites violated the 15th Amendment by preventing freedmen from voting. Enfranchisement means giving someone the right to vote, and disenfranchisement means taking that right away. After 1877, white people in the South used different methods to disenfranchise African American men, to prevent them, in other words, from exercising their 15th Amendment voting rights. Let's look at some methods that they used. The first one is called the poll tax. Southern states instituted poll taxes after 1877, and these laws required all people to pay a fee in order to vote. But because many freedmen were poor, they could not afford to pay this tax. So many of them stopped voting. Assuming that someone was able to pay the poll tax, they had to face the next obstacle that Southern whites used to disenfranchise freedmen, and that was the literacy test. The literacy test was a written test that people had to pass before they could vote. The questions on the literacy test were purposefully difficult and misleading, making it extremely hard for freedmen who had little education to get the answers correct. Since many freedmen were completely illiterate and could not read or write, the literacy test made it all but impossible for them to vote. But to stop freedmen who could pay the poll tax and were able to read and write, Southerners instituted something else, and that was called the Grandfather Clause. And the Grandfather Clause was part of local voting laws, and it said that men were only able to vote if their grandfathers had voted in the past. But since freedmen's grandfathers had been slaves and had not been allowed to vote, the Grandfather Clause meant that freedmen were not allowed to vote either. The last method was violence, intimidation, and lynching. White people threatened, attacked, or even killed black people who attempted to exercise their voting rights. And rather than face violence, many freedmen chose to simply not vote. If you don't know this term lynching, I will come back to it in just a moment. The Ku Klux Klan was a group that formed during Reconstruction in order to intimidate and harm black people who tried to vote. The Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, uses violence to maintain white supremacy. That's the idea that only white people should have political power. The KKK formed in the South, but it continues to exist today in many parts of the country. You will learn more about the growth of the KKK when you study the 1920s later in the year. The last term, lynching, is a certain type of punishment that whites often used against blacks as a form of intimidation. Lynching means that someone is killed as a punishment or a form of justice, but they do not receive any sort of trial or legal process. Lynchings are carried out by a mob, a large group of people. And when a lynching occurred, someone, in this case usually a black person, was accused of a crime, but instead of having a trial, they were automatically assumed to be guilty and the mob would execute them. In the Jim Crow South, the worst crime that a black person could be accused of was sexual intercourse with or rape of a white woman. During the Jim Crow era, hundreds of black people were accused of this crime and lynched. The lynching usually involved torturing, mutilating, or burning someone alive before they died. I'm going to show you a picture of a lynching now, and I want to warn you that it's disturbing. If you'd rather not see it, skip now to the end of the video. This is a picture of the lynching of a man named Jesse Washington in Texas in 1916. White people saw lynching as a form of entertainment, and when a black person was going to be lynched, white families often got in their car and traveled long distances just to witness it. Train companies in the South would even run extra trains on the days of a lynching just so that whites could go watch. At the lynching, people took pictures and sent them as postcards, and they collected body parts of the victim as souvenirs. This picture was sent as a postcard, and the back of it says, quote, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is to the left, your son, Joe." So the person that wrote this made light of the lynching and then sent the picture to his parents. Look at this graph of voter turnout in one southern state, South Carolina, in the decades after Reconstruction. In 1876, before Reconstruction ended, nearly 100% of eligible black voters were voting. But follow the line. Just 20 years later, in 1896, it had fallen to about 10%. During those 2 decades, the methods of disenfranchisement, including the poll tax, the literacy test, violence, intimidation, and lynching, had succeeded in preventing almost all black people from voting. Now it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, rewind the video and look again. I will see you in class. Bye, students.